But Uruguay did have communist embassies, and Hunt declared open season on these too. By bribery and coercion in the police force and military, Hunt could poach at will on communist preserves. Even if caught, the worst penalty would be discreet removal from the country. It was, after all, a friendly nation. Reports of Castro's death had been premature. Like Hunt, Castro had placed himself above the law, but at least he was an outlaw in his own land. By the time of the laying of the foundations of the new CIA building outside Washington in 1959, it was clear that the cornerstone of American policy in Latin America was the preservation of the status quo. Almost any change was viewed as a threat to American security. The American government and its agent Hunt were perfectly prepared to interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. Indeed, the job of the agent in the field was to do precisely that.
My specialty in CIA during my productive years was in political action, which I suppose is a euphemism for revolutionary or counter-revolutionary activity.
In Cuba, because of a confused policy, the CIA did almost nothing to hinder Castro's overthrow of Batista in 1959. Soon after, Castro began to move against American big business in Cuba. At the beginning of 1960, President Eisenhower toured Latin America, partly to sound out feelings there on Castro and the future of Cuba. In Uruguay, Eisenhower was introduced to his man in Montevideo. Shortly after his return to Washington, President Eisenhower gave the order to the National Security Council to start training exiled Cubans for a counter-revolutionary operation. The scenario was to be much the same as for Guatemala. But Cuba was not Guatemala, and Castro was not Arbenz. Hunt's first mission as a Latin American expert was to visit Cuba and make a report on the situation there. This was no longer the pleasure-loving Havana of his youth. The class with which Hunt identified had left Cuba, and Castro was beginning to lay the foundations of a socialist state.
I recognized that the country had gone Marxist. I saw the extent of the control that the Castro forces were exercising over a docile population. I knew that there were executions going on all the time. I traveled around among the people. My Spanish was good enough that I could get off the beaten track and talk with working men, with small entrepreneurs, small businessmen, taxi drivers, for example. And I included all of these observations in a report that I made back to the Central Intelligence Agency at that time. And among one of my recommendations that I think I've been criticized for, though I can't quite understand why, was that Castro be assassinated.
Hunt's recommendation to assassinate Castro was not acted upon at that time. Later, there was to be a number of CIA-backed assassination plots against the Cuban leader, all of them unsuccessful. To Hunt, it was a legitimate tactic in the unending crusade against communism.
We were at war with Cuba, albeit a clandestine war. Castro was the top of the Cuban pyramid. His homosexual brother, Raul, was not a man who could have taken control of the country or ensure the loyalty of the Cuban armed forces. And it was a perfectly pragmatic solution. If you cut off the head of the chicken, then the body simply flops around and you can do with it as you will.
Hunt was charged with helping form a Cuban government in exile, which would take over after Castro was neutralized in one way or another.